Dr. Greer, welcome back.
Thank you. Well, one of the things I wanted to get into, and when you look at this Atacama humanoid and you look at the density of the bones, and this is something that's a little medical and technical, but stay with me. Everyone's heard of osteoporosis, right? When your bones become thinner, don't have as much calcium in them as they need to have, and you take supplements. When you have a womb, fetus in the womb, there's no gravity. It's like it's in one of those floating chambers. The fetus is just floating in fluid. It's called amniotic fluid. And there's not a lot of calcium or bone density. And when the baby is born, having delivered many babies and taken care of trauma in babies that have been in terrible accidents, their bones are almost like Gumby bear. They're like Gumbies. They're flexible because it's mostly cartilaginous material, as opposed to hard bones that crack and break. Does this make sense? And the reason for that is that they haven't been up walking around, bang, 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 moving, it's a developmental phenomenon. So one of the things that Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗀 observed, and the radiologists in Spain, in Barcelona, who were excellent, observed, as soon as the images, just x-ray images came off, we did those before the CAT scan, they said, oh my God, what the hell is this? I remember them gasping because the bone density was that of a normal child. It wasn't of a fetus. And the size, 6 inches, they were assuming this was a fetus. And when they looked at the bone density, they said, well, there is absolutely no way this is a fetus that was aborted or a miscarriage. This absolutely, it was a organism that was up moving around. Because the other thing is that there are cells called osteoblasts. That this is why people, as they get older, if they walk around more, they have stronger bones. Because osteoblasts are stimulated to lay down more calcium by walking and moving and working out. That's why it's important for people, those of us getting older, to stay active. Now, what people don't understand is that a fetus, the x-rays, if you go to look at fetal x-rays, and you can do this on your own, Google it, you will see that the bone density of those versus this Atacama humanoid are vastly different. Any radiologist, medical doctor, looking at those, even a radiology tech will go, this is not the x-ray of a deformed fetus, full stop. So when we knew that it wasn't a fetus that was rejected by the time we got the x-rays out of the machine in 2012 in Barcelona. And Gary knew it, and Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗀, who was the world's expert on this. Let me explain. Dr. 𝗏𝗏𝗀 at Stanford literally wrote the textbook on skeletal abnormalities in children. Literally wrote the textbook. Renowned globally. He said that it was a 6 to 8 year old child. From not only the bone density, but also the epiphyseal plates, where the bone, when your bones are growing, there's still plates that are open so it can get bigger and bigger because you're still growing. Now, and in his comments, which we will post, he states that, well, there are some rare genetic conditions called progeria, where your bones age faster. So maybe that's not the real age. But he says, I seriously doubt it. He says point blank, in this particular specimen, he doubts that. He did not know.
Aren't they projecting that this was 6 to 8 years old, though, at 6 inches?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
This is in his report, word for word. I'm quoting from the report I held up a moment ago that it was a 6-inch specimen that was 6 to 8 years of age by both bone density. Now, the fact that they're saying this was an aborted or miscarried fetus that spontaneously, like when a woman has a miscarriage, is laughable. The medical evidence and the world's expert on this, and any radiology worth their grain of salt, would say this is ridiculous. It's junk science. So now we get to the question of how do you go from that to a major medical journal like Genome Research putting in this kind of misinformation to the public. And one of the things that was pointed out to me in my telephone conversation with this world-renowned geneticist is that he said that he said, I want to review the peer review statements. Now, often when you do peer review in a journal, the identities of who reviewed it are kept secret because they don't want to be attacked for having, not accepted your paper. But the statements they make are generally made available so that you can see what people said about it. The senior editor at Genome Research refused to give this renowned geneticist the comments and the review itself, how it was peer reviewed. What are they keeping secret? He knew that there was something very fishy there because apparently it must have been a junior editor who slipped this into this prestigious journal, and now they're running scared at Genome Research magazine. He also says that someone walking off the street into Stanford maybe could have made these mistakes on the sequencing and the fact that this old DNA is damaged, but anyone would have done the controls and not reached these conclusions. He said that they were obviously cherry-picked, and out of millions of changes in the DNA, they picked about 60 to create this predetermined hypothesis. And he said it would be headline news if there was one new genetic syndrome found in a living specimen. That they are claiming that there are 7 of them is laughable and implausible. I'm quoting. The data does not support the conclusions of that paper at all. So I think that this gets into the question of there's been a breakdown in the peer review process. There's been a breakdown in oversight at Stanford. There's been a breakdown in the people at publishing this, but also the science writers. If you're a science writer for the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN, you should have asked people, is it plausible that this unusual looking creature that had all this other evidence from Dr. Lockman, from the radiologist, the CAT scans, is actually a fetus that was miscarried? They would, if that data were put in front of any competent doctor, medical doctor, they would have said, no, this is ridiculous. And if anyone who would have gone through, now granted, it took 4 days for this world-renowned geneticist to go through the data files to see where the errors were made and where the cherry picking happened. And this caused him to conclude that what they did is that they had a foregone conclusion, which we know they did, because Dr. Nolan made statements to the public in 2012, 2013, when the movie Sirius was coming out. It's a deformed fetus. I mean, it's a deformed human. It's human. End of discussion. And that was reported in Science magazine and everything.
Stephen, I know, I have my viewpoint, many of our listeners do, why all of this is so hidden, why there's an aggressive discrediting campaign against people who are trying to be truth tellers and reveal what's going on like you've done in the ultimate ways. Why would you say this is happening, and can we even undo it?
Well, for the mainstream public, I don't think there's any undoing. I mean, we are irreparably damaged here because the scientific journals and the mainstream media have colluded on what is, I think, one of the largest scientific misinformation campaigns in modern history. I am not exaggerating to say when you have something that could potentially be, and we don't know, I want to say there's no proof yet that this is of an extraterrestrial origin, but even if there's a 1% chance it is, to have the DNA sequencing be altered, to have known science thrown out, such as the fact that something laying out in the desert is going to have changes in the DNA sequence that are not naturally occurring mutations on the bones that cause the bones to look like this, or the creature to look like this, but are the result of just normal degradation and decay. This is settled science. This is, how do you make these wild, spurious conclusions, which are published in a mainstream journal and then covered globally, and it's case closed. The case is closed.
It's the same with the space weapons issue. I mean, people are still, you mentioned weapons of mass destruction. People are still believing that they really were there.
Yes.
Or that the Russians colluded. And people are believing what's in the media.
Yes, they believe the media.
When I hear you, I start to get some hope, but then I wonder.
Well, here's what I think. I think that there's hope only because a large majority of the population doesn't trust the media. A large percentage of the population has begun to question these authority figures. Now, unfortunately, we used to have the citadels of truth were our prestigious scientific institutions. And what I'm worried about with this, and this is why I'm asking people to contact Stanford University and Genome Research in Cold Spring Harbor, Cold Spring Harbor is the facility and institution that Watson and Crick founded where they discovered the DNA molecule, and express their deep concern over the possibility that the peer review process broke down, that this then made it into the global media, and that the conclusions that are in the paper, there's a scientist in the LA Times who openly questions the conclusions. He says, this is Dr. Matthew Warman, an expert on skeletal genetic disorders at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard, cautioned that although the researchers identified known and novel genetic variants, they are far from knowing what role, if any, they played in 𝗬𝗏's many abnormalities. It's possible the genetic variants identified in the new research could be responsible for one or more of these events, but if he were advising 𝗬𝗏's bereaved parents or immediate relatives on her genetic condition and told them about their risk, I would be very cautious to use any of the data presented in this paper to draw any conclusions. Now, this is one of the renowned, this is in the LA Times. Those of you, if you can read, for God's sakes, read this. Here's my point. I'm trying to rest what we're doing on truth-telling and facts. Fact. The world's expert in skeletal abnormality said it's 6 to 8 years old. Fact. The radiologists have said that it could not be a fetus because of the density of the bone material. Fact. Dr. Nolan himself thought it was something extraordinary until 2 unconfirmed reports of federal agents approached him and he changed his tune 180 degrees. Fact, there were no controls done for this study, which this world-renowned geneticist has said would have rendered it thrown back. If you were just doing your PhD and didn't even have a chair, the Harris Chair at Stanford, the paper would have rejected with a 0 grade, he said, because there were no controls done on the study. And that the conclusions were based on cherry-picking sequencing that is almost certainly the result of oxidation and damage to the genetic material. And then on top of it, to say there were that many major genetic syndromes in one conception, one fetus, it would, he said, that amount of genetic damage would have resulted in its inability to even divide once as an embryo. In other words, to go from a single cell zygote into an embryo. It couldn't have even divided, never mind been miscarried or born. So none of this adds up. And so the only conclusion you can reach is, and he stated this to me, it's the level of incompetence of the scientific data is so great that you have to conclude one of 2 things. Either a big trick is being played or there is massive scientific incompetence. Either way, this is a major, major story. We need to get to the bottom line. I am calling, as the head of the global disclosure movement and a medical doctor myself and a scientist, I am calling for a major federal and state investigation of Stanford University, UCSF, Cold Spring Harbor, and Genome Research Magazine and their peer reviews process. And I am asking all other scientists who have the ability to review this paper objectively and the data objectively, and to review the paper that was published in 2006 that is settled science about how much DNA degrades and falls apart when it's in the environment, to get involved with this, because I do not have a PhD in genetics. And the way this is going to rest right now, to answer your question, is that my opinion is not going to be reported. I had the Washington Post and National Geographic magazine both interview me about this report, and I explained all these problems to them. Not a single word of what I said appeared in the media. Not one word, except on your show. Thank you, Carol. You are the only person that has allowed me to explain what our objections are to what could be one of the biggest scientific mishaps in history. Because we're not dealing with, oh, well, you know, they miscued something on an unknown primate. This could be a huge story that we were hoping could have broken wide open the possibility that we're not alone in the universe and there are other species of human-like creatures. And the fact that there is this Russian, now we need help from Russians to get this specimen that was a big one. It was like this large. It was a full grown. It was not. It was bigger than you had had in even a newborn baby, and yet the state examiner in Russia debunked it and said, "Oh, it was an aborted fetus girl again." Interesting. They're all aborted fetus girls. What is this? I mean, the thing that was said in '96 and what was said in 2018 are the same cover story. It makes no sense. But I think the idea for it being an aborted fetus girl came from somebody who knew how the trick was played by these black projects in Russia. Because remember, there are unacknowledged special access projects in the US and Russia that are hand in glove, that work together. It's global. And there are scientists in Russia that are victims. There are politicians who are victims, just like there are in the United States. And this gets into the whole question of we've got to have disclosure and a full investigation of this corruption, not just here in the United States, but all over the world. This is happening all over the world. And one of the things that I want to share is an email I got from one of the most senior CIA people in the history of the UFO subject. I do not want to share his name because he's still actively involved behind the scenes assisting us. This is one of the reasons I'm still alive. I won't go into that any more than that. This is one of the reasons I have not been successfully assassinated. And he wrote to me about this group on December 31st, this To the Stars Academy group. And his first email was very sweet because he said, "I hope you have not been negatively impacted by TTSA. I anticipate it will dissipate soon." That was on December 30th of 2017. And then he said, when I wrote back, "No, I'm doing fine. I was expecting this. This is why I did the movie Unacknowledged. And the reason I did the book Unacknowledged was because we wanted to have this information in the public before they started running their scams. Because I knew it was coming. Because what they were doing is that they were going to start doing a fake disclosure that portrayed the aliens as a threat that would then create the foundation for war in space and World War III, which in 1955, if you read Douglas MacArthur's speech, he said World War III will be interplanetary, that we need to unite the nations of the world. Ronald Reagan said we can unite the world around an alien threat. This has been worked on for 70 years. They have had a 60 to 70 year plan, long-term plan, to play the fake alien threat card. And we're seeing it before our very eyes. You and I have talked about this for 2 decades. But literally, we're watching this play out before our very eyes. So here's this email that I get the next day. He says, "I'm glad to hear all is fine, Steve. I have watched that Rat Pack referring to these people that I named on the TTSA group. I have watched that rat pack run scams against the U.S. government, loony billionaires, referring to Bigelow, and now the average citizens. Keep up the good work. I've been studying this subject for over 35 years. This is one of the most senior people in the CIA on the committee dealing with UFOs and ETs. Literally, this man, whose name I will not disclose at this point while I'm still alive, was the man who, after I briefed the director of the CIA for Bill Clinton, was asked to go into the Oval Office to clean up the mess when it was found that this subject was real and that the president and the CIA director at that time was being lied to about it. So this is the man who literally has an all-access pass.
Thank heavens for people like this, because even experts that we know, ministers of defense in other countries that we know and are friends with, have been sucked into this evil alien supposed scenario that's just not true, or we wouldn't be here, Doug. So thank you for getting this information out into the people who are making contact with you, and I hope more and more will, because as we're hearing, they're safe. Their names are not going to be brought out, so that the people can be protected who are coming forward, unless they want their names to come out.
Now, one of the other interesting things about this is that if we can get more scientists to go on the record, you were mentioning some that are contacting you from Bolivia, and study the details of this scientific report, it's going to be a house of cards. Because I think the man that I have been getting all this great information from, who is very famous, doesn't want to be associated with a scientific scandal like this. But we need people who will be associated with it, because it's hard to take on Genome Research Magazine, which is the premier peer-reviewed magazine in the world. It's hard to take on Stanford University. It's hard to take on the federal government. But this is what I have been doing for, as you know, 28 years. It's a very lonely place. I need help. I'm making a call for other scientists to come and please help us with this process. And I think that one of the things that we find is that when you look at the data that was put forward by Dr. Nolan's team and then passed through to this ridiculous journal article, which should have been returned from the peer reviewers with a 0 grade, you find that there is, we have to find out. And I want to be careful. I'm not going to say that there was deliberate fraud here, but there was certainly many errors. There was errors in the analysis. There was lack of controls done. One of the controls he talked about doing would have been, before you did any of the other sequencing of the DNA, is to do a very simple direct test of how many errors there are in the base pairs of the genetics, meaning how many cytosine switched over to C to A and T and what have you. If you look at the molecule, he says there are very inexpensive electrophoresis and gel studies that can be done that any competent lab would have done. Instead, what they did, they used a computer program that does it indirectly, that you can then fudge the numbers to show that there's less damage. He's saying this would be an easy thing to do, but now all this genetic material went to Stanford. And how are we going to fix this? How am I going to fix this problem? So we have to have people who are going to go in and say, look, the conclusions that are reached and the methodology used is not correct. Now, there needs to then be, I think, a criminal investigation. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. But I think there needs to be a criminal investigation into the peer review process of Cold Spring Harbor's Genome Research Magazine, Stanford University, and UCSF. And the reason I do is that this preeminent scientist has said there is simply no way that any competent scientist would make these kinds of errors. And there's no way that a journal should have let this get published. And then, because of the prestige the prestigious nature of the journal and the prestigious nature of Stanford, it got worldwide news, which has now submarined, completely torpedoed what we're trying to do with the Disclosure Project. This is something we also need to assemble a legal team. So if there are any people out there who are investigators, who are competent litigators, and any federal authorities, FBI, and National Institutes of Health investigators, because much of the funding that goes to Cold Spring Harbor and Stanford is from NIH. Our tax money. Our tax money is paying for this. And I think the public should be outraged in America that this report made its way into this prestigious journal and institution that is being funded by grants from me and you, taxpayers. And also Stanford, much of that research that's done at these universities is coming from the U.S. taxpayers, from the U.S. government. Much of it, most of it. And to have something like this happen, where one of the most prestigious scientists in the world in the DNA area with a PhD from Caltech stated to me, now I can't make this conclusion, this is his statements, that this is a trick. This is pulling a rabbit out of a black hat. There is no foundation for his conclusions at all. But this scientist from Harvard who is saying that you can't reach these conclusions. Because anyone who does ancient DNA research, let me just back this up. Let's say that you're a specialist in archaeology. You might be able to determine whether something's male or female, maybe, from the old degraded DNA. You would never claim you have 7 new genetic syndromes, never before seen in combination in the world, that would result in this phenotype. Phenotype meaning the physical expressed form of the genetic code. No one, nobody in archaeology genetics, no one in ancient genetics, no one with competent scientific credentials. And trust me, the people who were doing this at Stanford, Dr. Nolan and his colleagues, are very competent. So how can you can't say, well, there's complete incompetence because the people are competent. There has to be an element of something very dark going on here, possibly. I say possibly.
So you're saying that ancient DNA cannot be used to extrapolate genetic conclusions.
To a living organism, to an organism that was a living organism. It cannot be done. That's what that paper in 2006 stated. And that you might be able to speculate, but you couldn't reach hard conclusions. You might be able to say maybe this alteration is a mutation that occurred naturally, but it might have been just because the DNA decayed, was falling apart, sitting out in the desert for over 100 years. The point I'm making is that no competent scientist would have reached those conclusions. Who has a passing, superficial knowledge of ancient DNA that's been degraded. But at the same time, very interestingly, a very inexpensive test that should have been done at the first part of the research, which would have been the control, would have uncovered how much of that DNA they were sequencing had damage in it. Oddly, that wasn't published. And yet, I think it might have been done initially because the first emails I got from Dr. Nolan were that it was only 91% matching to humans. Now he's claiming it's 98%, but that's through this indirect measurement, not a direct measurement. So has there been manipulation of the methodology and the statistics and the bioinformatics? All of this is suspect. It's all very suspect, and there needs to be a full investigation by people who have competency in these areas, which frankly, I am a clinical medical doctor. Now, what I do have competency on is to say that this is 6 to 8 years old. Now, he's claiming that it was in the womb as a fetus, and that this progeria gene caused it to age as if it looked 6 to 8 years of age while it was still a fetus. Well, this is nonsensical because the bone density would not have been there at that level, and that this combination of progeria